My guest this week is Nick Brine. Nick has been a freelance recording engineer since 1996 and has worked in major studios in the UK and across Europe and America. He started his career as an assistant at Rockfield Recording Studios in Wales in 1993 at the age of 16, and soon became house engineer. Nick spent 5 years working for producer Owen Morris on a lot of legendary records, including the Oasis albums What's the Story Morning Glory and Be Here Now, The Verve's Urban Hymns, and Ash's 1977. Additionally, he has worked with hundreds of artists, including Teenage Fanclub, The Stone Roses, The Darkness, Bruce Springsteen, Nick Cave, Super Furry Animals, and the Beta Band, to name just a few. Nick's new record label, Flip Flop Records, has now established itself as a top UK independent label, and the first 3 releases on the label all charted in the top 20 on the official UK charts. They've also recently signed 90s icon Dodgy and signed a distribution deal with Rough Trade Records. Nick will also shortly be releasing a book of his career entitled From Britpop to Flip Flop. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome to Revolutions Per Movie, Nick Brine. Hi, Nick.
Hi, Chris.
So good to see you.
Yeah, same. It's been too long.
It has been too long. I had the pleasure of working with you on the Riding the Low album at Rockfield, which is the subject of the documentary we're going to talk about today. And Rockfield, the studio on the farm, and also Nick is a big part of the history of Rockfield, as well as the documentary, directed by Hannah Berryman in 2020. A lot of people know about all the musicians who recorded there. I mean, in the first minute of the film, it just says, over 50 years ago, musicians started arriving in a studio on a Welsh farm. This is their story. And then it just immediately, within 60 seconds, it's Ozzy Osbourne, Manic Street Preachers, Simple Minds, Tony Iommi, Dave Brock of Hawkwind, Tim Burgess of the Charlatans, Robert Plant, Stone Roses running around in angel and devil outfits, Chris Martin of Coldplay, Bonehead, and Liam from Oasis. And Liam basically saying, I can't remember a thing to be fucking fair, in 1 minute. And so if you're not familiar with Rockfield, you're like, I am familiar with Rockfield.
You are familiar with it. Yeah. It's brilliant. What a collection in an opening, in the opening 5 minutes, isn't it? And Liam couldn't remember anything.
Oh, he is such a star in this film. I watched this recently with my parents who have no idea, who he is, except when Champagne Supernova comes on, my mom goes, "Oh, I like that song." Oh, he swears a lot, doesn't he? It's a really charming film, just like The Place, and the film starts basically in 75 showing like a really kind of corny TV documentary style. Like, we're on the farm and there's no pressures like there is in London or New York to come here and do this. For people who aren't familiar with the geography of Wales, where is Rockfield Studios located?
So it's literally just over the border from England. So Monmouth is the town it's in, which is a great kind of old market town. It's where I grew up. Really great town, full of old musicians, retired musicians, some that had gone to Rockfield in the past and then loved the town so much and gone back and retired there. Robert Plant had a house there, so we was always popping in. Dave Edmunds is there. You've got all the Martinez brothers who've played with Robert Plant and Shawadi Waddy, and there's a big collection of musicians there. And it's literally just over the border. So Monmouth is right on the edge between, I think it's about 70% English actually there. So having that town on the doorstep of Rockfield is great. So it's southeast Wales. And Monmouth is a big part, I think, of Rockfield's success, having that town and the culture of that town and the people. I mean, I grew up there and you just got so used to walking down the street and you'll be like, well, that's a band. This is like a small Welsh town in the middle of nowhere full of farmers. And then all of a sudden, in the 80s, there'd be this 80s band walking up, whether it was Simple Minds or someone, or Adam and the Ants walking up the street. And you just got used to seeing it. And the locals are used to, I'll have a beer with Liam Gallagher today, or there's Manny from the Stone Roses. Manny's back and forth all the time.
Right.
So, and the locals so used to walking into a pub and someone being there. Dave Edmunds would sit in the same bar every night and have a beer, and chat to people. So, and Robert Plant was always there. So, yeah, it's a great little town. So, literally just on the border, just in Wales, and not far from Newport. Some people might have heard of Newport because of the legendary TJs, which was a great kind of indie club in Newport there, which started a lot of careers for a lot of bands.
The film does a really great job of showing just the landscape and the quiet, and also what the town looks like, as Liam and Bonehead are like, hey, we treat drinking equally to putting down a great track.
Yeah.
You know, and so you get the sense of this kind of like symbiotic relationship between the town and Rockfield. The film is about basically Kingsley and Charles Ward, two brothers who, discover rock and roll. There's a really sweet quote in it where they're like, rock and roll, cool, eh, man? Like they're just obsessed with it, and they want to be rock and rollers. They start a band. Yeah. There's a charming story of them trying to take their tape to George Martin at EMI.
Yeah, took their own tape machine.
Yeah, play him their little tape. They don't get signed, but it was kind of the beginning of them discovering that they could make music on their own. Do you remember what kind of recording device they had early on?
I mean, I think they were building their own tape machines, just little 1/4-inch 2-tracks, I think. Because they had the tape, and they were like, we better take the tape machine, because they didn't know whether they would have anything to play it on up there. They just didn't know. They just didn't really know what to do. So they took their own tape machine there to play their tapes. They got to reception. The receptionist said, oh, you have to take the lift up to the second floor. Monmouth didn't have any lifts, so the elevator for you guys. So they were like, what do we do? They'd never been in one before. So they didn't know what to do, because there wasn't any in Monmouth. So these farmers turned up carrying this tape machine up into getting the elevator, not knowing what to do, and then playing their tape for George Martin.
Oh, it's amazing. Also, the photos of them at this age, they look like they could have been in the Charlatans. They got this great bowl haircut.
Yeah.
You are ahead of the curve here.
Yeah.
Amazing. So it doesn't go well for them in terms of their own unit, but they realize that they can convert their attic into their first studio. And there's a great section where they're showing basically how they have like pig feed bags as insulation. And they just started recording tons of Welsh acts. At this point, it was mostly commercial studios were like part of the companies that were making these records.
Owned by the labels. Yeah.
Right. So something like this was really unique and abstract.
Yeah, until then you had to go, all the labels were in London. You had to go to London to record. The label would put you in their studio. So them doing this and was outside, especially outside London, the amount of people that just would say this is never going to work outside of London, so far away from London. I mean, now it's easy to get in and out, but then, do it then. But they just wanted to make music. They just loved music, and they were like, well, we've got the space. And obviously switched on, some clever tech people around them as well. And put it together, like you say, with whatever they had there. They were just used to build the studio.
Well, the film is full of moments where a lot of the artists in the film all talk about their first recording experience being kind of lousy in these kind of commercial spaces.
Yeah.
Like Simple Minds going to Abbey Road for their first record, and at 19, them being like, this is exciting, but it's super sterile.
Yeah.
Everyone's kind of generic. I don't feel any atmosphere at all. So having something like Rockfield must have been kind of mind-blowing, because also the journey just driving up to the studio is like, it's like Narnia. Like you have to go through a little bit of time and space to get there.
And then you reach that driveway, and that it just, even for me, having driven up it like thousands and thousands of times over 30 years, when you reach that driveway, it just still has, an effect on me even now. I think taking away the time constraints as well, that the sessions were booked by the hour, and you would go in. But I think having that taken away, and that being kind of a new thing where you could just create and not watch the clock, and kind of just come and go, and kind of go late into the night, because I imagine those commercial studios owned by the labels were probably not running in the the early hours. I'm not sure about that, but a Rockfield, just being able to go in any time and do it, and having that freedom all of a sudden. And Kingsley was picking things up because they got involved with Joe Meek.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, okay. They actually chose to go with Joe Meek over the other options that they had with George Martin. It didn't quite come off, but then they went with Joe Meek. So they went and recorded in Joe's studio in Holloway Road in London. So they picked up so much from how how he was recording things, production techniques, how he laid his studio. I mean, Kingsley can describe the studio in Holloway Road, just what it was, the way it was, and the landlady and things like that. They always screaming at Joe and stuff. So yeah, I mean, and Joe was a big influence, I think, on their production style early on.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, they're obviously proud at their not only invention techniques, but also how simple and practical they are. Like, Kingsley will be just showing a curtain and it'll be like, in other places, they just spend so much money on this. We just have curtains.
Yeah.
And they're all out of business and we're still here. He's like really proud of these simple things. And one of the amazing things about this studio is those reverb chambers that were originally for pigs.
Pigs, yeah.
What are the three chambers made of? There's three different ones.
So you've got the tiled one, the it's kind of concrete one or plastered one now, and the wooden one. And they designed them themselves with the engineers from there, like Dave Charles, who was a great producer engineer and played drums with a lot of great bands and in Kingsley's band. I think between them all, they designed those. They designed what materials they should use. They had the space. I mean, nowadays, if a studio had space like that, it would become, a commercial space that they could lease for something for revenue. But Rockfield have that option of using those spaces and being able to keep them as echo chambers.
And I guess I should say, for backing up a bit, what they basically did was they took their farmhouse that they grew up on and they started making different recording studios and using the environment to create a very unique space. So when we were making that record with you and you're showing us those chambers, of course you become super intoxicated by it. You walk in and it just sounds unlike anything else. It's just real reverb being recorded back and sent in the studio. And the funny thing is, at first you want to put it on everything. You're just like, it sounds so great. It sounds like John Lennon or the Plastic Ono Band. And then eventually you're like, all right, we got to dial this back.
Got to pull this back a little bit.
Like everything is just like, wow.
Yeah. But it's great how the buildings have dictated the style and the sound of the studio. That, those buildings are how they were. They didn't alter them and get, sound designers in and acousticians to kind of design the rooms to make a great studio. The rooms were the rooms, and they kind of put the studio into that. So that original character, everything you see is exactly how it was before they started. And like you say, they just kept on utilizing more spaces there. So it'd start in an attic. From the attic, they would move downstairs, and then that would expand into the next barn. Then they built the second studio, utilizing these spaces. And it's just amazing. The spaces are amazing, as you know. You've been there. And it's perfect the way they were. It's just, you can't imagine it being the other way.
It's magic.
It is, yeah. And you're in the coach house, and then the quadrangle is the one in the big courtyard.
So what was so interesting is when we were producing that record together, it felt like every time you had to go into the studio, like you're in the mixing room, you bust through a door, you walk down a hall, which is heavily featured in the film as like one of the best secret spots in this place where they record vocals in this long hallway that goes to a bathroom at the end. Then you bust through another door and then you start working and moving stuff around. And it felt like being a doctor almost, like washing up and getting scrubs. Every time I went through the door, it was like I had a mission. It was like on-off switch. It was so fun to walk down, bust in, do that, come in, bust out, do that. I just love the feel of it is just incredible.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? It gets me now. It does. And I enjoy seeing that on that you can see it on their faces when they walk in, when it's the first time they've been here. I get a buzz out of that when they walk in because I know they're going to experience it because you know how good it is. And I've seen that look thousands of times on people's faces, and even people who've been coming there for years. I work with artists who've been coming there 30 years and they still have that feeling when they get there,
It's obvious when people talk about it in the film. They are dewy-eyed.
Yeah, I mean, and you add the family into it. You add these little nooks and crannies, the little corridor, the little walk back up to the house where you just on that little walk, you walk past the Wonderwall, you walk past the wind vane from, Bohemian Rhapsody, you walk past where Oasis had the big fight, you walk past where Chris Martin wrote Yellow, and that's every time you go back up to the bathroom or to go make a coffee or something.
It's
Um,
incredible.
yeah,
And they're so kind. Like you go up there, Kingsley's hanging around.
yeah,
The daughter, Lisa, was
yeah,
hanging around, and Ward, who is Kingsley's, wife and just love of his life. He's
yeah,
so in love with her. And she, did a lot of the accounting. Also at times when they were on hard times, that's what she would do to keep the thing afloat. But I had a question because she talks about she was from the posh side of town
yeah.
and he was a farmer. Is there still kind of a divide in the town like that?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. There's a posh. There's the town. It's a very unique town. So, like, I grew up in the kind of estates up the top end of town, not the posh end of town at all. Um, and you're a very close community there. So it's a little place called Wysham. So if you're from Wysham, you're a Wyshamite. That's what you are. You
Uh-huh.
support Liverpool Football Club. You don't have no choice. That's it. From the bottom estates, you're a Man United fan. And then there's the posh end of town. Sort of Hereford Road, Osbaston. That's the posh end. It's still like that now. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and it's so funny. The kids Lisa and Amanda are like 5 or 6, and they're answering phones, booking bands. They just know what to do. It's like a total family affair.
Yeah.
And they're just kind of used to being around these rock stars showing up. Like David Cassidy all of a sudden is recording there.
Amanda's taking David Cassidy out on her horse all of a sudden.
Yeah.
She said, and then the following week I'm playing Frisbee with Freddie Mercury.
It's incredible. But the first band to come there and stay in their place is this band called Spring. And they're staying in their nan's front room, and that, just all of them sleeping in one space. But they just lived on the spot and they recorded on the spot. And it became the first residential recording studio in the world. And that was super unique at the time because people could just, like you said, there was no clock. You could decide, if you wanted to walk around the field or if you wanted to have a late breakfast or, if you had the luxury. I'm sure a lot of people were like, not today. Ozzy is like, I'm going to make a raft and shoot air rifles and stuff. It was the first residential recording studio, correct?
Yeah, it was. Yeah. Yeah. And so where they would have their food. And I think Kingsley's mum was involved in all of that as well. And they'd stay in the house and work till the early hours. Like I say, people could come and go out the studio, when they felt like it. And taking it for granted now because it's what, as musicians and producers, we've grown up with residential studios, but that must have been amazing to have that freedom all of a sudden and no labels around and you're away from your management. So all of a sudden the whole business is gone and you can just concentrate on the music.
Yeah.
It must have been a great feeling for those first bands, being the excitement of just being part of that, going to this place.
But it was even for me. I mean, I've made, albums in different parts of the world, but to like actually live on site and walk out and just walk across the field and go in and start working.
Yeah.
Also the magic, which they don't really focus on in the film, of just being in a place where you're like, okay, I know Queen, wrote and recorded Bohemian Rhapsody here, but what happened while they were eating and sleeping and all the stuff in the house where we're sleeping?
It's big brother going on at the same time as making a record, isn't it? Because you're eating.
I know.
I'm living with these bands for 6, it used to be always like 4, 6, 8, 10 weeks, and you're living 24/7 with these bands. And in the case of Stone Roses, it was 14 months, but it was a long time.
And I believe you were the one who said, do you want to see Roy Thomas Baker's gold toilet seat?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I was like, yes, I do. And there it was. I just was like,
well, he's like, I'm going to be here for a long time. They were there for about 10 weeks. And he was like, so I need my own toilet seat. And of course, it was a sparkly gold one, which he had put in, and they kept it. All those little things, they've kept. There's lots of those little things knocking about. And the buzz I get from showing people these little things and the little things that are bespoke to Rockfield, and seeing the excitement on people's faces. And I think they react to it, and I think we get the performances out of it. Maybe some of the young bands get a little bit intimidated at first. They feel like the pressure's on, they've got to live up to all this
history,
but they soon realize that it's such a relaxing, creative place that by day 2 they're in the flow and they're in it, and then they believe in themselves and they're living it as well. And I think it brings out the best in a lot of artists, who've been there. And I think they've able to recreate that elsewhere sometimes,
Agreed. Well, the first artist that really shows up in an interview in the film is Ozzy Osbourne and Tony Iommi. And Tony's actually sitting in the studio being interviewed. It's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
They're kids from Ashton, and they're like, we've never seen a field. We've never seen like nature, and for them, it wasn't even beyond the recording. But one thing that was so funny that was similar to my experience was, they're rehearsing Paranoid and stuff from the first album in the studio. And then Tony Iommi talks about Kingsley coming around, and he's like, and he'd start talking. He's such a nuisance. And I just remember being told, like, yeah, Kingsley likes to talk. And I was in hog heaven. I had some time once in a while to spend time with him. But again, it was that thing where he'd take you around and be like, right there, that's where Adam Ant stood.
Yeah.
Over there, that's where Freddie saw the weather vane. He was so excited about it still.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I've heard those stories for 30 years, but I'm still hanging on every word when he tells them. As
it was amazing.
Almost as if the story's all of a sudden going to change or something, or there's going to be a new ending. But obviously there isn't. But I still get excited just watching him because he's such a good storyteller.
Oh,
and
he's incredible.
Everybody's just like in awe of him, listening like on every word, and it's the buzz to watch it. And it's a recurring theme for everybody, I think, over the years, about Kingsley coming in and talking and taking up so much studio time. But you've got to have time for those kind of stories.
Oh, definitely.
When they got the Studio of the Year award, he went up to London for the to accept the award, and I think you get 3 minutes or something to do your acceptance speech. Obviously, that wasn't going to be enough for Kingsley. He had everybody up on the stage. He then got the guys from the Manics up, and I think there's some other guys from other bands, and they started playing, and he's conducting them while they're playing on the stage.
Right.
And he's going, and he's only got a few minutes, and he goes, right, so in 1962, and I think he got about as far as 77 before they pulled him off and had to get on with the rest of the awards ceremony. And it was like being in the studio,
There's so many bands that aren't covered in the film. You've got Teenage Fanclub, Flaming Groovies, Peter Hamill, New Order, Joe Strummer, Judas Priest, Motorhead, Radio Birdman, Suede, Vandergrift, Generator, Bauhaus, Annie Lennox, Echo and the Bunnymen. It's immense. And so I could imagine him being like, well, every decade has a story, and every decade has a different feel to it in terms of what's going on in Rockfield, in terms of it expanding or shrinking and the highs and lows of it. But some things I didn't know, like I didn't know Hawkwind did so much work out there. Yeah.
And you're right. It could be kind of broken down into, it's almost like a Netflix series broken down into maybe even 5 years of episodes. It's how can you fit all into one documentary? I think she did a really good job of kind of covering like everything and capturing the feel of the place and capturing like the family, and because the Rockfield story tells itself. It's just those bands, those artists. That's the story. It's amazing. But what about the family and how it started, all that stuff, and that's great what it captures. But you can't possibly cover it all. And the bands you mentioned, like Teenage Fanclubs of this world. I mean, how many people want to hear what happened when they were there, and when all those other Britpop bands that just exploded in the 90s and then the 80s scene. It could go on and on, and I always felt like someone like Dave Grohl would just go there and just do it. Such an amazing. He'd be so excited for a start when he got there, and
I can't believe he hasn't been there.
I know.
It's really strange.
Yeah, I think he'd make a great documentary on the place as well. But it almost needs to be a series covering the decades, or because even the Studio on the Farm documentary almost kind of finishes early 2000s. We've had another 20 years since then, and countless number ones, and and big artists, your Kasabians, and if you're talking about big bands and like Paolo Nutini and Katie Tunstall, these are massive albums. There's another 20 years, the last 20 years to kind of tell as well, but you can't fit it all into that short time. But the bands you reeled off there that aren't featured, it's like, what would anybody give for a list like that of bands that we didn't have time to feature? It's just incredible.
You could do one documentary probably on the Stranglers working there, and you could do another documentary on Annie Lennox doing her thing.
Yeah.
It's amazing. But I love that they picked Hawkwind. They're such an unusual band.
Yeah.
And a lot of unusual bands recorded there, finding their way, and then they came up with their own singular sound that when you hear it, you're like, all right, that's the Stone Roses, right? And you hear the beginning of Hawkwind, you're like, all right, I think I know where I'm going. Yeah. But it's so funny because this is also the period where drug use was starting to come into the scene, with even at the studio, and Kingsley gets busted for like cleaning up. He's just like, I'm just tidying up. Gets busted, and then they let him out, the next day. There's that great story of the Boo Radleys basically being like, oh, it's brilliant. You'd wake up and all your pills would be just neatly put in a row by the cleaning people and stuff. And our moms are cooking, and they're like, it was heavenly. And so then in the mid-'70s, they just started getting hits with like Ace, How Long Has This Been Going On, and Queen. And really, that's when the music business took over the farming business.
Yeah.
Which is so interesting because right out of the gate, they're like, there was never any money in the farming business. We weren't going to do that. And just, I can't even imagine how excited they were to see their dream kind of just be realized.
Yeah. And starting the label, and, Dave Edmunds, and, Dave's fairly local to the studio, and he turns up, and you've got this genius in Dave Edmunds as a musician, a guitar player, and as a producer. And, they work together with Dave's on the label, and then all of a sudden, they have success with that because he's selling his singles, selling millions of copies all of a sudden.
They don't really get into the label in the documentary. Can you talk a bit about that?
Well, they had the label, early on, Active Records. So with Dave Edmunds, was on the label. So that was successful straight off, really, because of Dave. And I think possibly they were doing one-offs with maybe Budgie and bands like that, I think.
Okay.
The label had many forms over the years, and then it kind of came back late 80s. They had artists, and they had some singers. They had one singer signed with Atlantic Records that came through the Rockfield label as well. She was a local Welsh girl, and she was working with all the big writers in America. Kingsley had her with Andy Hill and Carole King and Dan Warren and people like that. So the label got kind of resurrected again, which my band ended up on as well. And my wife was on the label. That's why I met my wife. The label. Yeah, but in the 70s, you're talking, Dave Edmunds being the main artist on the label.
Sure.
Success of that. Yeah, so they just, the 70s was that time where it just went to another level because of the bands, the sheer amount of sales that those bands were having that were coming through. And it was artist after artist having hits, and they were creating icons, like your Ozzy Osbournes and your Lemmys. These are, they were creating legends.
And then right on the heels, late 70s, early 80s, post-punk and new wave, Adam the Ants, record Ant music, and Teardrop Explodes and Simple Minds. There's that great story in the film. Jim Kerr is in the smaller studio with Simple Minds. They're like, who's recording the big studio? They've got a microphone set up in the courtyard, and it's Iggy Pop. And they're freaking out because they're just kids, right?
Yeah.
And it's so funny. They're like, was he on the wagon, off the wagon? What's the right way to say it? and they're like, no, he was on the wagon, but we weren't. So he started wanting to see what we were up to.
Yeah.
And then it's like all of a sudden David Bowie just shows up in a red suit with a Heineken and a piece of cheese. And I'm like, yeah, of course. It's Rockfield. Of course he shows up. Yeah. And then they're all like singing backing vocals on his album. He's just like, what is it? You're so simple-minded. They put it as a lyric, and they're just, the place has that feeling that like, people are constantly popping their heads in, whether it's Oasis looking at the Stone Roses or vice versa.
Yeah, that's how I first met Oasis, was them sneaking up the driveway to try and get a glimpse of the Stone Roses. That's how I met those guys. And it happens time and time again. I was just standing in the courtyard talking with Joe Strummer one afternoon. He was recording in the studio, and then Kingsley wanders over, and because he's got Dave Edmonds is with him, and Dave comes over to say hello, and so then Dave and Joe are talking. Then Robert Plant just turns up, and all of a sudden you've got these three musicians.
Oh my God!
They hadn't met each other, so all of a sudden they're round the coffee table. Me and Kingsley just sat there with our coffee, just listening to the conversation. Kingsley, like, quick, get a camera, get a camera. So yeah, he's got that great photo of the three of them together. But it happens all the time. It's just you're there and someone pops in, and it's so normal.
Well, they talk in the film about Charles starting Mono Valley recording studio, which is it up the hill?
It's no, it's further on. So in the village of Rockfield, it's about a mile past Rockfield. Is the old mill, which was Mono Valley Studios. So the one up the hill was the accommodation for the studio, which is Anchor Hill, which is where Charles lived. Okay. But that used to also be the accommodation for the coach house. They got that for the accommodation. The bands would walk down the hill, go into the coach house. But Mono Valley is about a mile on along the river there, and that became Mono Valley.
And they're very diplomatic about why. They're like, we just wanted to do different things. But it is kind of amazing. It was a lot of that just because there was just too much to do. Like they were bursting at the seams, or was it really like, I like running it this way, my brother likes running it that way?
Yeah, there was difference of opinions of how it should be done. And they had the falling out, and it was agreed that Kingsley would buy out and have Rockfield, and Charles would get Mono Valley and the house on the hill. So then he would live in there, and Mono Valley would be the other studio. Mono Valley became a very successful studio. It shows, both of them knew what they were doing. Both of them knew how to create a good studio. And then the old mill where Mono Valley was another place that just conducive to a studio. The way it was, you didn't have to change it. It had this massive window overlooking the river, which created this huge live room. It had this big wagon wheel, which was made iconic from the Oasis single cover, and the beams in the control room again. And the rooms were dictated. That was the perfect size for the control room. That's the perfect size for the live room. That's the perfect size for a vocal booth. They didn't have to put anything in, just, do some treatment and kind of make it kind of look like a studio. And it was great down there, great vibe down there. And a lot of bands started out there, the Manics and the Stereophonics and bands like that would, and Oasis would do their first albums down there,
Well, they start talking about how in the late 80s, people are leaning to electronic music, and they're not necessarily wanting to need a larger studio to make music. And they say it's always been feast or famine. Is it still that way in the recording industry?
It is. The period just before I joined, they had a really lean period. The studios hadn't been, very, very busy for a while. That late 80s kind of period, and then the Stone Roses came along and changed all that, and Britpop was born. And it was just phenomenal again. The bands that there's one year, I think we got to Christmas, and Anne's turned around and she said to me, "Oh, you're slacking a bit, Nick. You've had 6 days off this year." And
wow.
And sessions were 10 in the morning till 4, 5 in the morning, and right. I'd had like 6 days off. It was band after band. I would pack the studio down, and just as I would be taking all the dishes up to the house, the van for the next band would be coming up the driveway, and then there's no rest. You haven't been to bed, and then that session could be 6 weeks, and it would be back to back to back.
Oh my God.
And that whole period from the Britpop was born, and that was the mecca for all those Britpop bands. It was so busy, and it was like 7 #1 albums in a row, and it just took off. They'd had that lean period before I came, then it took off again, and then there was that lean period again, kind of 2005, 2010, and then it just went boom again. So Kingsley always says, the tide goes out, the tide comes in, and everything comes back around again. And the thing, he always says, the thing is, they're not very fashionable there, but if you're not fashionable, you can't go out of fashion. So it still looks the same there now, and they change with the times when they need to, or certain elements that they need to, but they still manage to do it differently in their own little way.
Right.
And so they always kind of stay relevant. And another great saying of Kingsley is they're so far behind, they're in front. But,
Well, this is around the time where you get involved. So you're just a young kid. You're like 15, 16.
16, yeah.
Yeah. So what did you know about Rockfield just living in town?
So I knew it was there, and I obviously used to see a lot of the artists. And you grow up in Monmouth, and you know of the studios, and you know which bands are kind of in town. But I didn't really know. I was a musician. I was in bands, but I didn't really know what to expect of this place. I kind of had this image in my head that it would be this kind of grand, kind of country manor kind of thing. I never been out there. And my dad had the local taxi firm, and my dad was like, "No, son, it's not quite what you think. It's just a farm, But in my head, it was not going to be just a farm. It was going to be
Right.
this manor house, this special place. And because my dad was there, he was always picking Robert up because Robert had a place just up the road, so he would pick Robert Plant at 4 o'clock in the morning. My dad was always driving him around everywhere, or Ozzy, or everyone into town, all these bands. So they all knew my dad there. I didn't know much else about it. I didn't really know how records were made, but what I'd been reading, I was reading a lot and kind of watching documentaries, all the VHSs, and I was kind of taking it all in. But I still didn't really understand it. And I remember just going for my interview. I got the interview because I knew someone who was working there, and they were leaving. And he said, "I think you'd really like it. I think it would really suit you, and you'd be good at it." I was like, well, I'm only, just turned 16. I'm still in the middle of my exams, and I got to go to sixth form, then I got to go to university. And he was like, "George, just go for the interview." So my dad took me down there at 16 because I couldn't drive. And I remember my dad was just laughing because he knew what was to come, So I walked in the office, and there's Kingsley in this old jumper that had so many holes in it, and I think it was covered in porridge and mud. And he just talked at me for about half an hour. I didn't say a word. He didn't ask my name, anything like qualifications, nothing. He didn't ask me anything. I didn't speak. He just talked to me for about half an hour about how terrible the music business was. It's so bad. Producers are terrible. We need to go to university, become an architect. Don't even think about getting in the music business. And then at the end, he just said, "But if you think you want to do it, give us a call later on and we'll sort it out." Because he knew my mum and he knew my dad. So he was like, "I know your family. So if you want to do it." So I got back in the car. My dad goes, "How did that go?" And I was like, "Well, I have no idea how that went. I didn't say anything." And my dad said, "What are you going to do?" And I was like, "Well, it's the summer, so I might as well do it over the summer." My last exam was that Friday. So I called up Kingsley and said, "Yeah, I'm going to give this a go." And he said, "Good. See you 9 o'clock on Monday then." And that was it. So I get there and I'm standing in the middle of the quadrangle courtyard. There's nobody there. I have no idea. I don't even know at this point what my job is. I've just been for an interview. I didn't know what for. I don't know what I'm going to be doing. And then one of the maintenance guys came across. He said, "You must be Nick." He says, "Oh, you're in that studio." And then Kingsley appears out of nowhere waving some keys at me. And he just said, "Here's the keys to the studio. Don't lose them. Have a good time." And then that was it. He was off. And then so I go in. I'm just waiting for someone to arrive. And then the first person that arrived was Andy Wallace. And I recognized him straight away because he'd just, been involved mixing Nevermind. And he was great with me. And I said, "So what's going on here?" He's like, "Well, we've got a Brazilian band. It's Sepultura. Great band." So he taught me through. I was like, "I have no idea what I'm doing. I don't know what my job is. No one's told me." And he was like, "Well, you'll be tape popping and the T-boy and kind of assisting." He said, "Sit by there," and and he was brilliant with me actually for that.
That's great.
That month. I just had Andy Wallace all of a sudden telling me how he, got those drum sounds, and yeah, it was brilliant. And thrown in at the deep end, and from that, I was working with Simon Dawson, who was a Rockfield engineer at the time, and he was going to be engineering the Stone Roses album. And Simon said, "I want you to come on to that session with me," which originally was booked in for 6 weeks. So I said, "Okay." was a fan of the Stone Roses. I was like, I can't believe this. My best mate was a huge Sepultura fan, and I was a big Stone Roses fan. So they were my first two sessions.
And they stayed 14 months, right?
14 months. Yeah, yeah. So,
what a different time. Like they were just throwing money at the band to just figure it out, make a record on your own. Did they work very hard?
No.
What was 14 months like?
I mean, they were on Geffen at the time. So it was Tom Zutaut signed them to Geffen. And the mission was to just spend the entire budget. So they were doing crazy things like they rented a car. I think they rented the car in the end for about 2.5 years. But nothing opulent, nothing fancy, because that's not their store. So it was like a Ford Fiesta. And I think they ended up paying like 3 times the value of the car. And then by the end of it, they'd set fire to the car and had to pay for it anyway. So it was just money was going down the pan, left, right, and center. No, for me, it was great because that fast tracked me as an engineer, because Simon Dawson, who was a amazing engineer and producer, we had all this studio time because the band would go home for days, weeks. There'd be days on end where nothing would happen. And Simon would just sit there and go through everything with me. You need to read this manual. This is how this works. And he'd said to me, right, well, there's nothing going on for 3 days. Bring your band in. The best way you're going to learn is to start recording.
Amazing.
My band would come in. All of a sudden, we're using John Squire's guitars and amps and Rennie's drums. And my band were all huge Stone Roses fans, and we're only 16, And
right.
So we had all this free studio time, and I was recording it, and Simon was around if I needed him, and he just took the time with me. So that year with the Stone Roses fast tracked me. So by the end of that, I was engineering. I was away because I had all that time to learn and soak it all in, and it fast tracked me as an engineer, really.
And how quickly did the Oasis album come after that?
So night 3 is the Stone Roses, and then night 4. So as I said before, I met Oasis when they were down at Warner Valley doing Definitely Maybe. They would come up, so I got to know them. And that kind of came about for 2 reasons. One, I'd started working with Owen Morris as a producer. He came in with Ash, and we did 1977. I started engineering for Owen, 94, and started doing a few other bands. As Owen was involved with New Order, with Johnny Marr, lots of things, and then he did Definitely Maybe. And I started working with him. We did the Ash records, and then he was doing the next Oasis record, and they'd already decided they wanted to go to Rockfield, and they asked for me because I was the house engineer on the Stone Roses record, so they wanted me. But by this point, I was working for Owen anyway, so I would have been on the session anyway. So yeah, not long after that. So I was 17 when I first started working with those guys. But by this point, I was engineering for Owen, and also doing lots of other Manchester bands, really, and lots of indie bands and Britpop bands.
And Oasis, at least in the film, Bonehead and Liam's discussion about being in Rockfield, and they're like, oh, it's great. You could live there. It was like Big Brother with tunes. Yeah. And it's like, yeah, it is. It's kind of like that.
Yeah.
But they seem to say that their work ethic was like, bash it out, bang it out. Was that true? Did they bash it out?
It was. I mean, Noel was in the studio. For What's the Story, Noel was in the studio nonstop. It was work, work, work. So, and when we were working, the rest of them would go down the pub just to get them out of the way. So by the time they come back from the pub, Bonehead would bash out his guitars. Liam would bash out 3 takes of Champagne Supernova. That's that done. And we would do a song a day. So it was a song, we did 15 songs in 15 days.
Amazing.
Noel would lay down a guide guitar and a guide vocal to a click track. And then Alan White would go in. He was new to the band, and thrown in the deep end, and he wouldn't take many takes, 3 takes. And then we'd do the edits to the tape, because we're all on analog tape at this point still. And then Noel would start building the tracks, and then the others would add their bits. And by the end of the day, the track's done. 15 days, 15 songs.
Amazing.
Yeah, they were just kind of throwing it down. I mean, Noel was in there. We worked a lot, long hours. The rest of them were kind of back and forth at the pub. So I was in the studio a lot of the time. A lot of the time, I would have to go to the pub to make sure wasn't too much trouble, and I'd be keeping an eye on Liam and Bonehead. And
Was that easy?
yeah, I mean, I knew all the locals, so I knew who they could and couldn't bring back, and who,
Right.
where there was going to be trouble and where there wasn't going to be trouble. But I don't know. And I was the taxi a lot of the time. I was bringing them back and forth. Right, Liam, you need to come and sing. So I'd go and drag him out the pub. And I knew, he'd be in one of 3 or 4 pubs. So I'd go and find them and then I'd bring them back. And then he'd do them. And I might take him back to the pub afterwards. It was easy on that album. By the time I did Be Here Now with them, the media frenzy and the paparazzi was absolutely mind-blowing on another level. And my job a lot of the time was kind of keeping Liam occupied out of the studio when no one's trying to get stuff done. So, and that was a lot more difficult because the press intrusion and what they had to deal with at that time, being I was just crazy, absolutely mind-blowing. But that was in London. That was at Abbey Road and at Air Studios, and we went all over studios in London. But because we were in Rockfield, it was quite easy for What's the Story, because as you know, you're in the middle of nowhere. No one's really bothering you. People in Monmouth are so used to seeing these characters that it's just Liam Gallagher to them. We're going to have a pint with him. We're going to have a drink. So it was easy during What's the Story. Meant Noel could get on. So kind of babysitting Liam was fairly straightforward for that. And it was bashing it out, but it was a lot of hard work. But Noel was just on it. So it was.
Yeah.
He knew what he wanted. He had all these songs written. It wasn't a plan as such, but he was just on. He was free flowing. It was just coming out, and to be able to do those songs just out in a day. By the end of a day, this thing exists that we're all listening to, going, this is going to be around forever. This is kind of history right here with those songs. In the morning, Champagne Supernova doesn't exist. In the night, it exists, and you're blasting it back. Everyone's off their faces, and you just knew. You knew.
That's incredible. The film also has great moments where you just realize Bonehead and Liam are like, I didn't like Wonderwall when I first heard it. It sounded like reggae. They're like, man, I didn't like it either. It's just weird.
Yeah.
And you talked about the wall before, which I'm sure, do people come to look at the Wonderwall that Noel sat on to mic the acoustic track?
A lot of people turn up to get a photograph on it. All the bands want their photograph with the wall. I do these Oasis events where we kind of talk about the making of What's the Story. I recreate how the studio was set up for the making of the album, and we have a tribute band comes in and plays it. We have various people involved in that period of Oasis, whether it's Brian Callen, who was doing all the artwork and design for them. Owen sometimes is on a Zoom from Costa Rica,
right,
giving us some inside information. And you get people sit on that wall and they're crying, because it means so much to them. And you get it when we get a lot of Japanese tourists, and when Kingsley plays Bohemian Rhapsody in the studio, and they're all there, they're crying, they're in tears.
Yeah. Well, that's what's so funny is like, there's that. And then at the same time, Bonehead's like, yeah, I got a little RV car, remote control car. And he's tracking, and I'm like, and trying to throw him off. It just shows in such little bit of conversation what the dynamic of that band is.
Yeah.
They're making high art. They're making classics. Yeah. But at the same time, they're like, fuck it.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm going to ruin this steak. I'm going to piss him off as much as I can. Yeah.
Exactly.
He sat on this wall just Noel's like, what the hell am I doing up here doing this? Kingsley's wandering around because there's a bit of moisture in the air, and we've got about 20 grand's worth of microphones up on top of this wall.
All right.
Kingsley shouting, it's not raining. Rhino, it's not going to rain, is it? Get those mics in. All this is going on while Noel's just trying to get this take of the acoustic guitar down. So I set him up, and the mics are up on the wall, and he's actually on this little stool on the wall, so it's quite unsafe up there. He's got to get up on a step ladder, and everyone's just laughing at him. But he's decided that that's the best place to record the guitar for Wonderwall. And then the birds you hear on that take, we flew them into the start of the album. So at the start of that album, when you're hearing all those birds, that's the outtake of Wonderwall.
Oh, you can't make a record there and not drag a microphone outside. I bet every session someone's like, "Hey,
Yeah,
can we do this?" You're like, "Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, we can," and we've done it.
yeah, yeah,
The other thing in the documentary is you talk about it, and so does Bonehead and Liam, is the fight
yeah.
that happened while they were making the record. What the hell did that feel like? Were you scared or?
I mean, it was. I mean, it was a crazy night. I can't. We've been working non-stop that day, and Liam had gone out. I couldn't go and get him from the pub because we were in the middle of doing stuff. So I was busy. And as soon as he came back, I looked at kind of who'd come back, and I was thinking this is trouble. And he'd also brought a band back that were recording down the road at Mono Valley, and it was that was the main issue. That band from Mono Valley, really, because they started trashing the place. And Noel's obviously come out of the studio. He was in work mode, and he just wants to relax. And all of a sudden, there's all these people around, and it's kicking off. Owen's gone to bed, so he actually, yeah, and it all kicked off. And there was fights between various people, and then that started and between Noel and Liam, and you're trying to break this up. This is going off, and I'm trying to stop people going in the studio because people had gone in the studio, and Noel's guitars had got broken, windows had got smashed. So I'm kind of trying to stop that happening in the studio and get all that locked up and get everyone out of there. And in the meantime, this fight's happening, and they're chasing each other around. Well, Liam's chasing Noel with a cricket bat, and it's carnage. The place is, destroyed. It's trashed. But we managed to usher everybody out of there. Noel gets off with Alan. Noel didn't drive, so he's got Alan White to drive him back to London, and he's gone. And when he's left, he said, "That's it. It's finished. It's over." So that was it. And I remember Owen waking up the next day, and he's, he gets up right then. We off to the pub. That's the first thing that Owen does in the morning. We come to the pub before we start work. Then, Brino. I'm like, well, yeah, we can do, but I don't think we'll be doing any work, will we? And he said, "What do you mean?" And I'm like, "Well, it's finished, isn't it? They've split up." He had no idea. He hadn't heard a thing. He's completely oblivious to what's gone on. And so we fill him in, and that was, yeah, for a little while. That was the end of Oasis.
Amazing. What was it like being in the documentary, being a subject?
Loved it. Yeah. When they asked me to do it, of course, it's like, really wanted to do it, but I'm kind of one of the few people who were there in that period, that iconic kind of Britpop period, really. So having someone who's the fly on the wall for all of that, but being asked to do it was great, especially because they were really good. Catherine and Hannah, just who were making the documentary, they would come to me for bits of info, who should we speak to, and kind of little bits of information on the place. So yeah, and then when they said, "Oh yeah, we've got to feature you in it," I was like, "Oh, this is great to be in it with, the people who are in it."
Oh, the stories are amazing. Robert Plant tells great stories. You tell great stories. Everybody is just happy to share.
Yeah,
it's all kind of the beginning of so many people discovering who they were going to be. Like Robert Plant is like, I was just a cliche. After Led Zeppelin was done, there were thousands of singers without shirts on. I was kind of a joke. And, he reinvents himself at Rockfield by recording Big Log. And then he's like, I felt like I could do anything after that.
Yeah.
It seems like time and time again, people felt most like themselves at Rockfield.
Yeah. Yeah, they did, those bands that go in there, your Kasabians, your Coldplays, that writing and producing those records that set them up for the rest of their careers, and being so comfortable at Rockfield and being so creative there. Yeah, it's just a special. I think you saying people finding themselves and almost their sound, and I think Rockfield just allows them to be able to do that. The songs that have come out of that place and the careers that it's launched. And smaller bands as well. The bands that I work with, like the Beta Band and stuff like that. Rockfield allowed them to. They're the most creative band I've ever worked with.
I can imagine those records are amazing.
Without a doubt. But they couldn't have done that without a place like Rockfield for some of those ideas, because they manufacture their own samples and they manufacture their own sounds, and they've got these crazy ideas. And Rockfield has all these spaces and nooks and crannies and areas you can do these things and create these unique sounds. So it helps people get what they've got in their head out, and that's difficult in any studio. But Rockfield maybe just allows you, because let's put the mics outside. Yeah, of course we can. Let's record on a wall. Yeah, we can. Let's drag a plow across the stones and make, it sound like whatever you want it to sound like. Let's hit things. Let's record at 4 a.m. and there's no neighbors. So it's just, you can do so many things.
I thought one of the poignant things in the film was John Leckie, who produced a ton of artists at Rockfield, a legendary UK producer. And at one point, there are people talking about, like, the person in Abu Radley's like, I just do everything up in my loft now. I can do everything I can do at Rockfield at home. And right after that, John Leckie says, recording at home, it does have the potential for perfection, but perfection is not always what you want. You want something that has magic and feeling. You want to capture some mystery. And he says, the reason why people love those Stone Roses records is that there's a mystery in it. And I feel like, Rockfield is a component. It's a character of all these records.
Yeah. I
didn't know what Rockfield was when I had those Beta Band records, but you look at the list of who's recorded there and you're like, of course, I can feel it. I can see it. I know that could have only been made there.
Yeah.
Not in some studio in London
yeah.
or in Manchester. It's like, of course.
Yeah.
As you're building other studios around the world, what are you bringing from Rockfield?
Not to kind of over-engineer them and over-design them, really. So, I mean, you can't always do that, because sometimes you're working in a small space and it's, like a community hall or something like that. It has certain features you can't do, but that you can't do much with. So you kind of, the different spaces, the different sounds you can get within one building. I bring that to it, and the way Rockfield is run and the kind of that kind of family atmosphere. It's so difficult because Rockfield it's so vast and it is so unique. But everything I've learned, and like obviously I've picked up what other producers love about it, what engineers love about it, what artists love about it. And it's always in my mind when I'm thinking about what can I do with this space. I mean, the closest I came to it was I did Leader's Farm, which was with Dan Hawkins from The Darkness. So we went into business together. He bought this old 350-year-old farmhouse in the Norfolk countryside. And for me, it was like, right, this is as close as it gets. This is a blank canvas. We've got a big budget. This can be special. And we came really close because you can't recreate the history of somewhere like Rockfield, but we created this magic that when you walked in, it just had a feeling. It just felt right. And he'd been to Rockfield to do the second Darkness record with Roy Thomas Baker producing, me engineering. And his thing was, right, we need to take all the best bits from all the residentials that we love and we need to put it into this. And when people came there, when producers came and they'd say to me, this has the like a feel of Rockfield with a mix of Ridge Farm Studios or the Manor, and the buzz when you get that feedback from people. And that place wouldn't have been as good had Dan not done spent 16 weeks at Rockfield, and had I not been at Rockfield for those years. And when people came, very, very quickly that studio just went through the roof, with C6 Steve and the Arctic Monkeys and Katie Tunstall and Nick Cave and Steve Harley straight away. But I don't think we would have had that had we not put the essence of Rockfield into it. So artists wouldn't have come there, or certainly wouldn't have liked it as much as they did and come back, and that's, it's always in my mind when I'm doing a studio. It's always there in my mind. The we got in Spain, your studios we got in Spain. It's a different thing because you're trying to retain that Spanish vibe, because when the Brits love Spain, so when they come, it's got to be as Spanish as possible. But
right, sure.
But even then, you're still thinking, oh yeah, but what would Rockfield do, or what would what bit of gear makes it like special, or what can we do with that little space? It's always in the mind.
Yeah, even Tim Burgess in the movie says they've tried to make their own kind of studio, and he's like, but it's not Rockfield.
No.
He's like, I like to make records. We made our own thing, but he's like, no, it's not nowhere near as good as Rockfield. Yeah. I am so excited that you're writing a book too, because I could talk to you for hours about, again, you could have a mini series about you and these artists. So I'm so excited about it. Is there a story that wasn't captured in the film that you were like, oh, I would have loved to have had this been part of this documentary?
Oh, loads. I mean, there's loads. There's obviously some that couldn't go into the documentary that are in the book.
Sure.
And there's great stories in the book which aren't related to Rockfield because of all the other things around the place. But yeah, there's certain ones, the Rockfield one. I mean, Shane MacGowan story, the Shane MacGowan story is very poignant because actually Shane died while I was halfway through writing that story about Shane and his time at Rockfield. And the record I did this to kind of change the way you write about the story, but actually remembering all that was one of the craziest sessions I've ever done at Rockfield. If someone asked me what was you can forget the Darkness, forget the Gallaghers, it was the Shane MacGowan session with Brian Robertson from Thin Lizzy producing.
Oh my God.
Yeah, a crazy session. I actually thought back then, I mean, this is 96. So I actually thought back then, how is this man still alive? I thought that in 96.
Right.
And watching him, I mean, trying to function as a human, let alone a musician, was really difficult. But then when he was on it, you were like, this is why this guy is up there with, the greats. He could just turn it on and was a fantastic musician. But I think having that insight into the Shane MacGowan's world, it's probably a story that would have been good in the documentary.
Yeah. There's too many. You're right. There's just too many.
Teenage Fanclub stuff, the personalities in that band and the stuff that we all got up to. I mean, any of that stuff. And the rock bands, I do lots of big rock bands like Thunder and the Choir Boys, and just those guys. It's just, yeah. Where does it end?
Well, I'll be getting a first pressing.
Yeah, you're in the book. You're in the book, by the way, anyway, because I talk about Paddy's session in there.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's in there.
We had a lot of fun doing that. I felt probably like you did at 16, where, I'm in another country, in a legendary place, but it was so fun.
Yeah.
It was so fun to just try things.
Yeah.
I was very honored to work with you, and it's been so great to see you. So at the end of every interview, I ask the same question, but I tailor it depending on the film we're talking about. So on a scale from 1 to 14, with 1 being the lowest and 14 being the highest, how many months of engineering a new Stone Roses album do you give this film?
I think I'd probably, it's got to be 14, hasn't it? Without a doubt.
Yes.
Months.
Agreed. This film is charmed. The stories are charmed. I love this film. I watched it twice in one day. Like I said, I watched it to do research again. I'd seen it many times before. Then I ran over to my parents just to share it with them.
Yeah.
Because I knew they'd love it, with my dad coming from farmland. Everyone is so truthful and honest and funny.
Yeah.
And, there's highs and there's tragedies. But it is incredible that Rockfield still is just itself. And like you said, it's stayed unique.
Yeah, it hasn't. It's, as relevant today as it's ever been. It's busier than ever there. Just the bands that are coming through, just if you go back the last 12 months, you're talking, bands like The Cure, Pan and the Teenies in there, and Royal Bloods are big bands, #1 records still.
Amazing.
It's nice when bands like Royal Blood come and their careers launch from there, and you see it all happening again. Another generation now of bands that is doing it too. And mind blowing. The film's good. She's done such a good job. But what just like knowing the place so well, the biggest thing for me is it does capture what it's about. It does capture the family and the uniqueness of the place and what it meant to these people. But the mind blowing thing is the documentary is still only a tiny part of what has actually happened there, and how many artists have been there, and the kind of vastness of the whole story. It's just still a snippet. There's so much more.
I know. Incredible.
It's like, a director's dream, I guess, isn't it? Because a headache to try and condense it all into this little bit. But
right.
I think what they did is they captured the essence of it, and that comes across. And whether you're into music or whether you like any of the artists, it really doesn't matter, because it's just this really great story from the heart about this family that did this thing and these two brothers, But where you could just go on and on. But we need to push somebody to get this series done, don't we? The decades, go through the decades.
Oh my God. Indeed. I mean, it could go on forever. It would be amazing.
Yeah.
It'd be the longest running documentary series of all time.
Yeah, wouldn't it? Yeah, it'd be good. You get a different presenter to do each decade, that's relevant to that decade or whatever. And it'd be a great series.
It was so good to see you. Thank you so much, Nick, for joining me.
Yeah, great. Nice to talk to you, mate.
Thank you for listening to Revolutions Per Movie. We release new episodes every Thursday. We are a completely independently produced affair, so the best way to support us is to rate and review the show on your favorite podcast app and to subscribe to our Patreon over at patreon.com/revolutionspermovie, where you can get exclusive weekly bonus episodes every Sunday, as well as one-of-a-kind handmade Revolutions Per Movie goods that I send out to you. You can follow the show on social media at Revolutions Per Movie and find more information about our various guests in the episode show notes. Thanks again, and we'll see you next week. Bye!